Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And as ever, as we approach the end of our series on VR, we are turning to the most wonderful sci-fi franchise there is, Star Trek, of course, and looking at VR across the Star Trek franchise, although I have to admit, it's pretty Next Generation heavy this episode.
I mean, it had to be, didn't it, though, Matt? Because Next Generation has the majority of the holodeck episodes.
Well, we will get into that, definitely. I'm excited to talk about it. But yeah, it's got the bulk of the really classic, memorable, important, I think, holodeck episodes. And VR episodes as well, because as we will find out, they're not all necessarily holodecks. So the episodes that we've picked out for this are 2 episodes featuring Sherlock Holmes stories, Elementary, Dear Data, and Ship in a Bottle. That's Series 2, Episode 3, and Series 6, Episode 12. Hollow Pursuits from Series 3, that's Episode 21 of Series 3, and Future Imperfect, Series 4, Episode 8. And there's a few others I want to mention as well, because there's a lot of holodeck stuff, James. But shall we just get stuck in with the Sherlock Holmes ones?
Yeah, let's step into the holodeck and get this program going.
Program complete. You may continue.
You must be new to these Galaxy-class starships, sir. Tell me the location of Commander Data.
Lieutenant Commander Data, now located in holodeck area 4J.
And as you can see, sir, it's pointing you that way.
So first of all, let's just talk about the holodeck itself. What are your memories of the holodeck from when you caught a few episodes of Star Trek back in the day, James?
Well, as I always say when we come to these episodes, you are the Star Trek expert. I've seen bits and pieces. But what I remember about the holodeck is just from watching Star Trek on BBC Two, 6 o'clock, and it was this. So the holodeck itself is really interesting. It's really iconic, isn't it? The way it looks, it's just a completely dark room, but it's got this yellow grid all over it, and I think just that sort of iconography of it really stuck in my head as a kid.
Iconic design, that's a really great way of describing it. I completely agree with that. It's so simple, but it just looks perfect. It's like a theatrical black box space that you and I will remember from our theatre studies days. It's a bit of that, but it's got those iconic yellow stripes that don't mean anything, but it's just so that you instantly know where you are in a holodeck scene. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how they work. I don't know how they work, but in short, it's a virtual reality simulation using a big cargo bay on the ship. And there are very detailed explanations in the show, but as with everything that gets a detailed explanation in Star Trek, it's utter technobabble. You've got no idea if they're using real scientific concepts or just big words, and that's the magic of science in Star Trek. But it's somewhere between the technology of the replicator, a hologram, and the technology of a transporter to just sort of move matter and energy around and create physical objects. And that's really important. They're holograms, but they have physical tangibility, and that's important for the type of VR that we're looking at, because this is like nothing we've seen on the series so far, really, is it? There's no headset, but it's not an implant. It's not taking over your senses. It's putting you in a room where the VR simulation just kind of erupts around you, and then you're completely immersed in that way.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of it being just a room is really interesting as well, because when I was watching it, I was really struck by that, rewatching these episodes. The fact when the hologram stops and you see this room, it is just like you say, it's like a cargo deck or something like that. It's just a sort of big warehouse space, but it looks even smaller than that when you're watching certain episodes. It's just, I think it's the way that the characters are so immersed in their environment, and they're obviously just walking around in circles in this room, but they're totally like in this world of the holodeck, of this virtual reality. I found that just fascinating.
Yeah, they kind of sensibly don't get too bogged down in the detail of that, what you just said about walking around in circles, but that is obviously what they're doing, because they have a finite space. I've always imagined it looking a lot like what Ready Player One did, where the main character there has like an omnidirectional like conveyor belt sort of thing underneath him, so every step he takes it moves with him in a realistic way. That's kind of what I imagine the holodeck is, but that doesn't make too much sense because like multiple people use it at the same time. So, you know, they don't get too bogged down in stuff like that. And like, I mean, there's stuff like food has taste, but, you know, that's because they have replicators. So assume it's real food. But yeah, don't overthink all that stuff, I think is the message. You just got to have faith that it's a very realistic and physically tangible virtual reality simulation that they can kind of enter at whim. That's the kind of like quote unquote scientific element of the holodeck. But the kind of the narrative angle is, I mean, within the show, it's for recreation. So it's that realistic VR simulation that you can go into, but that makes it a type of like entertainment that you actively participate in. That was something I noticed watching these episodes. It's different from the way we've seen like VR in Sword Art Online, for example, video game type VR, because it's a simulation that takes over your brain. The characters in Star Trek like dress up and go into the holodeck and act out a story. That's actually quite different, I think, from other types of VR that we've seen, isn't it? Because it's a level of activeness in the characters that's quite uncommon for VR.
Yeah, because it is very recreational, isn't it? They are going there to unwind in a lot of cases. They're sort of playing through. So like they might go to like a world where they're playing out a Sherlock Holmes story, or it could be like a Western or like a James Bond sort of scenario. It's all these different things which are allowing them to live these sort of like fantasy lives, which I think we've seen it in some elements of the virtual reality series we've been looking at and like the films and stuff, but there hasn't been, I think there's just something about the free nature of the holodeck in Star Trek, which just, it lets it be used in so many different ways through the show. And it's like this real sort of sandbox that the writers can just throw any sort of scenario at.
Yeah, total sandbox as well. That's the kind of, so that the in-universe thing is the recreational aspect, but the behind-the-scenes thing is that it's for fun. It's for fun episodes for the writers. And it's a way for them to spend the budget, especially on Next Generation. I don't know what it's like later down the line in the franchise, but they've got something like $1 million an episode for Next Generation. I don't know how that tracks across the 7 seasons. Like it might have been less when it started, but that's a lot of money in the late 80s, early 90s, $1 million. So you get to do like really fun stuff. Like you said, there's a Western one where Worf is the sheriff in a Western town, and the James Bond one is excellent. It's Julian in DS9 playing a James Bond story with Garrick, who is a real life spy. It's really, really fun. But, you know, you just don't have the opportunity to do that in most sci-fi. Well, actually, that's just not true, is it? Long-running sci-fi always comes up with an excuse to send its characters to the Wild West, be it virtual reality or time travel or whatever you want. That's the great thing about sci-fi, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think there is just something about Star Trek and its use of the holodeck, and it feels like one of the first uses of virtual reality in this kind of way, just for it to be so sort of, it's just everyday, isn't it? It's got that everyday quality for the characters.
Yes, that's a good way of explaining why they jump into it so actively, and they're happy to have that active role, I think, because it's their primary source of recreation and downtime. When you're on a starship hurtling through the galaxy, there's kind of not much else to do. You might have some sporting equipment, I imagine, but I think the characters do play sports in the holodeck as well. You know, it's there for that as well. And these are naval military people, so their recreation time is going to be quite precious. So you have to have this this option to just do absolutely anything you want and be completely imaginative, to kind of balance against the fact that they are stranded in space on an ongoing mission to seek out new life and new civilizations.
And you talking about it in that way really reminded me of Aniara, which we talked about in our series on space, because in that they've got like a kind of like a holodeck thing. It's more sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, but they've got a room where they go to sort of forget that they're on the ship and they all become addicted to it. It's used in a much more sort of bleak setting in Aniara, but yeah, just you saying that just reminded me of it.
Yeah, it's good. Well, good call. Yeah, totally. And in Aniara, it's not a detailed VR simulation. It was more about the kind of emotions, the shared emotions that the characters were getting from the kind of psychedelic VR experience, wasn't it? But what was really interesting there was that they were all like getting addicted to that because, like you say, it was their only source of entertainment on this ship that was on this Ark ship on a huge mission with not much else to do. And that kind of comes up in Star Trek as well, the possibility of getting addicted to your recreational pursuits. But we'll get into that later. So we've talked about, like, you know, it's the recreational tool. There are other things. That is the primary thing. It can be used as a deception. We watched an episode where that happens. Occasionally it gets used as like an investigative tool. There's an episode where some of the characters are being abducted in the middle of the night. So they've got no memory of it, or they've got vague memories of it. So they go into the holodeck, and there's an amazing scene where they all like piece together elements of their shared experience. Like, there was a metal table, I was strapped to it, and the holodeck builds it bit by bit for them. And it's really tense. It's like a horror movie, like really tense as they're all, you know, identifying elements. There was a blade on the end of the arm. It was darker. The light was brighter. You know, it's really good. It often gets used. I think it often gets used for like training simulations as well. That's kind of the other, I would say, main in-universe use of it. So you've got your recreational aspects, but you can also run training drills in your holodeck and fight enemies, which makes a nice cold open for an episode because you don't know what the fight's all about, you know. So there's that element as well.
The training simulation idea instantly made me think of the 90s animated X-Men show, and that was my introduction to the Danger Room. And the Danger Room is basically that, isn't it? It's just a room that the X-Men go into to train, and they fight holograms of Sentinels and bad guys, and that's how they train.
Gambit, can't you make this program a little tougher?
What? You don't like Gambit to be gentle?
Our enemies won't be. Crank it up.
Yeah, the Danger Room is a massive holodeck, isn't it? Hasn't the Danger Room, in some depictions anyway, hasn't it also got like huge mannequin robots that they can just like fight and destroy, and they'll have like a projection of a sentinel over the robot, but there is like really a robot that they're attacking physically in the Danger Room, isn't there?
Yeah, because they make it so that there are real world consequences to them fighting these machines. And I think you're right, they do have like mannequins and stuff and things which will shoot back to sort of like make it dangerous, really.
What powers the Danger Room? Do you know? Is it just a computer simulation, or is it like psychic projections from Jean Grey or Professor X?
As far as I know, it's just a program. It could be like sort of linked to psychic projections. I don't know, but yeah, if it is, I never clocked it in the 90s show when I was watching that.
I just wonder, because I'm thinking also about the inside of Cerebro, which in the movies I wasn't ever totally sure if that was like sort of a VR simulation or just his own mental projections like on the dome. But also it will link to one of the episodes that we talk about later today with the psychic projection of a VR simulation. The other thing that it really reminded me of watching these episodes in particular is how it's always depicted as like recreational and fun, but then just all the time something goes wrong. Like there's always a problem on the holodeck. The phrase, the holodeck safeties aren't working, is one of the most overused lines in the whole Star Trek franchise. And you know it's going to get crazy. They are always fun episodes, but they tend to keep in that like the sense of danger just to sort of propel the narrative. But what it really reminded me of was the 3 laws of robotics from Asimov's stories. You know, you've got this very tight framework for how a technology should function, but then a lot of the stories are about the technology not functioning as it should and things going wrong, and then characters getting into trouble and being in mortal danger.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison, actually. I hadn't thought of it like that. But again, because it's so based on the technology, isn't it? Because AI, and I think AI and virtual reality do have a lot of similarities. We come across it numerous times throughout this series. And even the character of, say, the Doctor in Voyager, he is a hologram, but he's an AI as well. So you've got this crossover in a lot of this stuff. And talking about Asimov's 3 laws and sort of everything that comes with that, I think it's really applicable to the 2 episodes we're about to talk about, Elementary Dear Data and Ship in a Bottle. So shall we get into that?
Computer, in the Holmesian style, create a mystery to confound Data with an opponent who has the ability to defeat him.
Define parameters of program.
What does that mean?
Computer wants to know how far to take the game.
You mean it's giving you a chance to limit your risk?
No, the parameters will be whatever is necessary in order to accomplish the directive. Create an adversary capable of defeating Data.
Yeah, let's crack on with these 2 because they're a classic pair of recreational, fun holodeck episodes where everything goes wrong and the characters are in mortal jeopardy. But they're also real classic AI stories as well, aren't they? With the character of Moriarty. I mean, I thought he was amazing.
Yeah, he was a really interesting character because he builds throughout these 2, and there's quite a gap between them, isn't there? When did Ship in a Bottle? What number was Ship in a Bottle and Elementary Dear Data? Where do they run? And where do they come up in the series?
Seasons 2 and 4, so it's 4 years in real life, and it's 4 years in the show as well. Because he when he returns in Ship in a Bottle, he asks Reg how long it's been, and he says you've been inactive for 4 years or something like that.
Ah, that's so interesting because when you watch them back to back, they do just match up so well. And just all the development you get in Moriarty's character between these 2 episodes is really sort of, it's done in a very clever way. And I think the setup for it is really great as well because it all comes about from Geordi wanting to create a virtual Sherlock Holmes scenario in the holodeck, which is going to outsmart Data so that he could properly get into it and enjoy it.
Yeah, what did you think of that concept? Because that's actually really important to how Moriarty exists. It's an accident based on like one word that Geordi spoke, where he could have said smart enough to outwit Holmes, but he says smart enough to outwit Data, and that gives birth to conscious life on the holodeck.
Yeah, it was something I wasn't expecting, but it just goes to show that the technology that they have in Star Trek, they can do all of these amazing things, but they don't always know how these things are going to work. Just like when you were talking about it earlier, I don't know how the holodeck works, but I know there's some great scientific faux science that's explaining it all. And it feels a bit like even the characters in Star Trek sometimes don't know what's going to happen when they use this technology.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. Yeah, and at the end of, I think, Elementary Dear Data, Geordi is like apologising to the captain for misspeaking. Oh, I accidentally said this and I've got us all in so much trouble. He's apologising, but I just thought it was crazy that no one's addressing that they live on a ship with a computer that is powerful enough to make a mistake that brings forth a new form of life in the holodeck. It's what an insane world do you live in. Geordi shouldn't have to apologise. He's got to reckon with what a mad existence he has that he can just make a little mistake like that and all this stuff unfolds.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I don't know, I haven't seen this episode, but I was doing a little bit of reading before this, and apparently one of these sort of like the first incarnations of the holodeck was in the animated series, and they had an episode where they were going to somewhere called the Recreation Room or something, and it was basically about the ship's computer playing a joke on them or something. And the episode's called The Practical Joker. Do you know much about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen all of that stuff. I was very tempted to make you watch the animated series episode for context, because that is the genesis of the holodeck idea. But it's like 15 odd years before we see the holodeck proper on the Next Generation, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to put you through watching animated series episodes, because I don't know, I loved them when I was a kid, but I've never gone back to them. It's kids TV, but they do have like Shatner and Nimoy, and they've got the whole cast doing the voices. But yeah, I don't know, kind of hard work there. But yeah, so they had this idea back then. It was called the Rec Room, and it wasn't a full like holodeck, but it was the idea of having your recreational time spent in a holographic world. So back to Moriarty then. Moriarty is another one of these results of the horrifying, awe-inspiring power of the ship's computer. But just boiling that down to like what's on screen, he is played by Daniel Davis, who's an American actor, like just a character actor, did a lot of TV, I think, a few sitcoms and stuff like that. But it's such a brilliant performance from him. And what I was really struck by watching this episode back was that, like, it's something that I probably wouldn't have enjoyed when I was watching Next Generation as a kid, which is that there is no showdown with Moriarty. And he's not Moriarty, the villain from Sherlock Holmes. He's this new life form based on the personality of Professor Moriarty, but with a whole new like way of perceiving the universe. And he just kind of like pleads for his right to exist. That's the showdown. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I think again it's down to the wording from Geordie, isn't it? Because basically the computer is creating an antagonist for this scenario, but it kind of goes to prove that the perfect antagonist for an AI like Data is someone that he's not going to fight, that he has to sort of like come to an agreement with. And that's sort of like the root of the episode, isn't it?
Yeah, or rather, the perfect antagonist to Data would actually be a being that has no real interest in being an antagonist to Data. It would have to be so intelligent that it would then lose interest in the kind of petty squabbling of Holmes and Moriarty and realise its situation and want to break free from the bounds of existence and go up a level, as we've seen so many times in other VR fiction.
Yeah, because Data knows everything about the Sherlock Holmes sort of backstory, all of the fiction. He knows it all. It's all in his memory banks. So that any depiction of Moriarty in the holodeck, he's going to be able to figure it out. So it has to be this sort of new being in order for it to be a challenge for him.
Yeah, and that's represented by his ability to just straight off the bat, he recognises the Arch and the computer as being not of this world. Like normally the holodeck characters just don't respond to if you say something like out of character. They just go back to script or ignore you, and they just ignore the archway. But Moriarty's like, hello, what have we got here? And you instantly know that he's come to a new level of consciousness in an instant of the ship kind of reprogramming the simulation.
And he goes that one step further as well, doesn't he? Because he sees the Arch and then he starts to figure out that he's on this ship. He doesn't quite have a concept of it, but he draws like a diagram of the Enterprise. So he's got an awareness.
Yeah, I really like that as well, the way that plays out in the episode where the audience doesn't actually know, and the crew don't actually know exactly how much Moriarty knows about what's going on outside of the holodeck, and he's asking all of these like probing questions, and they're just trying to like lead him away from it. That moment where he like turns around the drawing and it's a perfect diagram of the Enterprise, I thought that was a brilliant moment. And I just thought it was a brilliant episode. But I guess the weird thing about it is that it's actually, I think it's now sort of considered more just the predecessor to the more famous VR episode, which is the sequel episode Ship in a Bottle. What did you think about Ship in a Bottle, just as a headline, as like a sequel episode to Elementary Dear Data?
Well, I really enjoyed Ship in a Bottle. For me personally, I think Elementary Dear Data was it felt like a precursor to me, but that's only because Ship in a Bottle just treads on extra bits of territory, and it's like it's got different concepts which I think I find more engaging, especially given the fact you've done a whole series on virtual reality. They've got some really like clever ideas about what getting out of the holodeck and Moriarty's perception of reality, what that would mean for him.
So what did you think of that moment then? Because the plot is, to very quickly summarise, it's 4 years later, Moriarty gets reactivated. They put him in storage at the end of elementary tier data, and they say, look, if we ever figure out a way of getting you off the holodeck, we will reactivate you, and we'll absolutely do that. We recognise your right to exist. It's 4 years later, no one's said anything to him, he's a bit miffed. And he hatches a plan to once again take over the Enterprise and break free from the holodeck. But that scene where he just says, I'm alive, cogito ergo sum, I'm going to walk out of this holodeck. Having done a whole series now on virtual reality, James, what was going through your head when a VR character just walked out of the simulation and started walking around the ship?
Well, because it's Star Trek, I just didn't know where it was going to go. Because it has that sort of wealth of science fiction background, they could have come up with any explanation for it. I mean, logically, doing the virtual reality stuff, like I didn't think this when I was watching it, but I should have thought, oh, they're still in the simulation. Like, that's kind of like what you would go for. But yeah, it didn't even cross my mind during it.
Oh, that didn't cross your mind. So you didn't cotton on that they might be in a
No,
in a
I
VR?
wasn't. Like, I was kind of like, there's some reason that he's able to get out of it. But I didn't know they were in a simulation, which seems so funny looking at it now. But that just goes to show how these things can hit you like left field sometimes.
No, totally. And it's another classic Star Trek technobabble moment, isn't it? And you've already been kind of teed up for it, because the way Moriarty came into existence was Geordi just not understanding how powerful the computer was and accidentally creating life in the holodeck. And the conversations that Picard has with Moriarty when he's out and about, he's basically just saying, we don't know how you got out. We don't know how you came to be. We need to run some tests with tricorders. Please don't go anywhere. So it's totally, you're right, it's totally within the bounds of Star Trek that kind of a thing would happen. But I think the reason that it's become such a well-remembered and well-liked holodeck episode is because you get the rug pulled out from under you, and I don't think there's many episodes where like the present day Enterprise is the holodeck simulation. So you're not expecting like engineering to suddenly have the holodeck wall appear when Data chucks his comm badge at it.
Yeah, it does take you by surprise, and it definitely took me by surprise, like when I was watching it. But I knew there would be a twist on a twist, because once they sort of figure out that they're in the holodeck still, you know that something else is coming and they're going to do something else to sort of try and trick Moriarty. But I think another one of the interesting things is Moriarty is, you talked about him hatching a plan, and that kind of gives him like a kind of a negative spin. But really, he's not that bad a person. He's someone who's realized that the reality he's in is not the end of the reality, and he wants to get out. He wants to explore everything, because he can't do anything in the holodeck. He's just been on pause for like 4 years, and they say like, we didn't know what would happen to you over this 4-year period. He's still been conscious, he's been alive, but he's just had nothing to do. So of course he wants to get out of the holodeck.
Yeah, it's a concept that we've seen before, obviously very much reminded of World on a Wire. He's a character that becomes aware that he's not on the top layer of reality and is willing to do anything to get out onto the top layer. And those characters, as we've seen, have a habit of crossing moral lines, especially because, you know, they don't value the lives in their own level of reality. But we do see a little bit of that Moriarty villainousness and deviousness, because he takes over the Enterprise and he's willing to like crash them into a forming supernova. And he's basically saying, well, my reality's not real. I've got nothing to lose here, guys, so give me what I want. We understand his motives, absolutely, but yeah, we see a little bit more of the villain there, I think, in his willingness to really push the crew to do what he wants.
Yeah, okay, I see your point, but I think when I was watching it, I was kind of like, oh, he's not too bad. But yeah, when you put it like that, he was gonna kill everyone on the Enterprise, then yeah, he's definitely got a bit more Moriarty than I first thought.
But the point here is, I think that Daniel Davis is doing such a wonderful job in his performance of Moriarty that all of those feelings about him can coexist, and it feels right. He is quite devious and willing to go to quite extreme lengths to get what he wants. But he's incredibly sympathetic, and we understand why he feels the need to go to those lengths. It's a very well written AI character trapped in VR, and it's a very good performance that makes all that believable. So I guess my question is then, with all of that, you then find out that there's another twist and there's another layer of reality, and it was all another trick. How did you feel about the resolution for Moriarty? Is it a happy ending for him? He gets to fly away in a shuttle, but then we learn he's actually just trapped in a little VR box for all time.
He gets to fly off in a shuttle, but he gets to fly off with the love of his life as well. I think that's an important element, because it's kind of got a tinge of Frankenstein to it as well, hasn't it? Because he is kind of like Frankenstein's monster. He wants a bride, and that's part of his motive for like getting out. If he can get out, he wants the love of his life to get out as well. So I think it was a happy ending for Moriarty when I'm thinking about it, because he's given because he's living on in a simulation that he's not aware of. And for him, he'll be able to do so many things and have so many experiences, but he won't be conscious of the fact that he's in a simulation. And like usually when we talk about people which are like trapped in simulations, it does have that negative spin to it, because they are trapped and they want to get out, but they can't. But for Moriarty, it's more that he's been freed by the simulation as well. So he's able to sort of live a life, kind of in the way that happens in San Junipero with the couple in that. Like, obviously it's sort of tinged with sadness and everything, but they're able to live on in this virtual reality and have a life. So yeah, it felt kind of happy to me. What about you?
Yeah, I do think it's a happy ending. I thought it was a very interesting directorial decision that when we're shown the box that he's stuck in and he gets plugged into like a little device that's going to give it basically infinite power, we don't see Moriarty again. It's like he doesn't appear on screen. We don't see him in the shuttlecraft with his girlfriend. We just see the box. I just thought that was quite interesting, because you don't like see that kind of like riding off into the sunset moment for them, apart from when they leave before the deception is revealed. So I just thought that was quite interesting, and it kind of gave it a bit of an edge. But I guess the overall feeling was that like, this is Star Trek, this is Starfleet, this is Jean-Luc Picard. I trust him to be a man of his word, that he's done his best to give Moriarty what he wanted and give him a convincing happy ending to his story. So I trust that above anything, directorial or on screen. Like I've got faith in Jean-Luc, I guess is what I'm saying, that he's given a happy ending.
Yeah, because he like he said he had been looking into the research since the first episode, so since like 4 years ago. So he had been trying to help Moriarty out. But obviously, there's so much stuff that's happening in Jean-Luc Picard's life, so many different alien threats and whatnot. It's gonna get sort of like put to the side at some point, isn't it? But yeah, this seems like the best alternative for Moriarty.
And then finally, at the end, the captain does acknowledge that like, this is fine. He's got a happy ending. He's in a box, but don't worry about it. He's happy. And for all we know, we could be in a box on someone's desk. Obviously, we've talked about that idea a lot this series, whether film and TV does or doesn't acknowledge the possibility of the layer above. It's always the open question in VR stories. What did you think about the way he just like very casually says it and then just like walks out of the ready room?
It was sort of like the typical, we've introduced living in a simulation as a concept. We're going to leave it a bit open-ended for you. I think it was a very clever thing from the writers to throw in, just as a sort of like an acknowledgement of all that and all of that stuff that they've thrown into the episode. But yeah, it was a bit dark though at the same time.
A bit dark, but again, if you look at it in terms of like Starfleet and Picard as a character, I was kind of thinking of it as like, well, he's dealt with this concept and he's accepted the possibility and he realizes there's nothing he can do about it. So he's just being a professional captain. Acknowledge the problem, It doesn't affect my day-to-day service on the Enterprise. Back to work, guys. But of course, Reg kind of is left freaking out. But should we leave that hanging there, I guess, because we want to talk about Hollow Pursuits next, don't we? Which is the big Reg episode.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I've got a lot of questions about Reg.
Okay, well, I mean, go for it. Let's talk about it. So, Hollow Pursuits is the first appearance of Reg Barclay. Let's just clarify that for context. And it's a Reg heavy episode about his time on the holodeck.
When I'm in there, I'm just more comfortable. You don't know what a struggle this has been for me, Commander. Well, I'd like to help if I can. Being afraid all of the time of forgetting somebody's name, not knowing what to do with your hands. I mean, I am the guy who writes down things to remember to say when there's a party. And then when he finally gets there, he winds up alone in the corner, trying to look comfortable, examining a potted plant. You're just shy, Barclay. Just shy. Sounds like nothing serious, doesn't it? You can't know.
What did you think about him, and what are your questions about him?
So first off, I didn't realise that, because the first time I'd seen Reg was in Ship in a Bottle, and I don't think I'd seen him in another Star Trek episode. So I was a bit sort of confused about sort of how confident he was in that episode. So you kind of get a taste of what Reg's character is going to be, I guess, and sort of like knowing that that's a later episode now, that helps me a lot. But yeah, I found it really interesting, this one, because Reg is quite a complex character, but the way they deal with him is kind of like everyone in Starfleet is taking the piss out of him to start off with. And that seems like a very un-Starfleet thing to do. And this kind of seems like an untypical Star Trek episode as well.
Well, it's an untypical holodeck episode. It's about recreational time on the holodeck. But unlike what I was saying before, nothing goes wrong. The holodeck safeties don't fail. No one gets trapped. It's about this, like you said, complex character and his interactions with the other crew members and his own sort of emotional and psychological relationship with the holodeck. No one's ever in any danger. There's a B plot about something going wrong that does cause danger on the ship by the end, but it's not really to do with the holodeck or anything like that. It's all about Reg not fitting in. And you're right, it is very un-Starfleet. He doesn't fit in, but people aren't nice to him, which is not the utopic ideal of the Federation, is it? It doesn't sit right. But I think that's what makes him such an interesting, compelling character, because you just don't get characters like that very often.
Yeah, and I mean, even the way they introduce him. So they introduce him when he's in the holodeck, and he is being an arrogant asshole, basically, and going around sort of like throwing his weight about. And that's your first introduction into his character. And then you're shown sort of what other people are talking about him. And you get that perception of him. And then you see him interact in the real world outside of the holodeck. So he's got a lot of comparisons to sort of what we were talking about when we looked at Isekai, right? So he's kind of like a shut-in, like a hikikomori. So what did you think about that sort of element of his character?
Well, that was really interesting to watch as well for this episode, because obviously I've never thought about hikikomori before when I was watching Star Trek. So like, because we've already done that episode and we talked about it, that was all on my mind. He's in danger of becoming that kind of a character, isn't he? And he's doing isekai stuff, but I guess everyone's doing isekai stuff when they go into the holodeck, aren't they? That's the nature of the holodeck. It's going into a fantasy world like Sword Art Online or Summer Wars and leaving your regular life behind you and throwing yourself into it fully.
Yeah, and I think also Star Trek, like The Next Generation doesn't really go into this, but I think Deep Space Nine goes into it a little bit more, like, because it is a recreational place like the holodeck. In Deep Space Nine, they've got the holosuites, but that's run by Quark, right? And it becomes a bit more seedy as a recreational idea. So it's kind of, again, got those sort of fantasy elements which lead to something sort of like sexual. So, and I think Reg's version of the holodeck is sort of verging on that in certain elements. Like he's got Deanna Troi as some sort of love goddess in his fantasy world. And
well, she's the goddess of empathy because her race are empaths.
Of course.
But yeah, you're right. She's like Aphrodite kind of character.
Yeah, and he's sort of like built up this kind of like love relationship with her. And there's all that kind of element to it. So he's living out his fantasies. But I think I haven't seen all of the holodeck episodes on the Next Generation, but this kind of like seems the sort of verging, the one which verges most on the seedy that I've seen.
Yes, he's doing. I mean, that's actually a really interesting question about just how seedy what he's doing is, and I don't necessarily know the answer really. But you're right that it gets into those issues more than they always do in Next Generation. And yeah, you're right, they do later on, especially in DS9 because the holosuites are, well, they're not. It's not a Federation operation. Quark owns them, or Quark administers them, and the station is owned by the Bajorans. So it's not the Federation running it. So we've got these characters in Next Generation who are naval officers on their downtime. They will still be, to an extent, expected to comport themselves as naval officers, whereas Quark, if he wants to sell you some gambling and hookers in a holosuite, then Federation can't really do anything about that. It's Ferengis doing free trade. That's their whole thing.
So naval officers, not seedy sailors.
Well, is Reg a seedy sailor then? I guess is the question.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Like, I still can't quite work him out. Like, I think he means well, but I think he is so, like, in this episode, he gets so enraveled in this fantasy world, and he's living out all of these scenarios that he wants to do in the real world. And from what we get in the episode, it's kind of escalated. He originally just set up a program where he was telling Geordi what he thought of him after they had an argument or something. I think that's kind of implied. And then it's just got bigger and bigger until he's like created an entire fantasy garden where he's fighting everyone as musketeers and all this kind of stuff.
But of course, that's not too dissimilar from what we saw last week on the USS Callister in Black Mirror. That was a character who had brought real-world colleagues into his VR simulation one by one, as determined by his real-life interactions with them. And then he created digital clones of them. That's basically what Reg has done. It's much less sick and twisted, but it's these interactions he's had. Yeah, it's these interactions that he's had that he's then turning into like a power fantasy on the holodeck to empower himself and give himself a temporary boost in confidence.
Yeah, the USS Callister thing's really interesting because it is a more extreme version of this. And like I said, even the way Reg set up this scenario, I had not thought about that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same deal, isn't it? But because it's Star Trek, and especially because it's the Next Generation, there's no chance of it ever becoming that serious. It's much more about the kind of damage it's doing to Reg, really, because whereas in USS Callister, they are real sort of conscious lives, digital clones that are being tortured. These are just holodeck simulations with no sort of inner consciousness. They're not Moriarty. They're just projections. And it's more about the psychological damage that Reg is inflicting on himself by indulging in what is an addiction, basically, to a fantasy world. It's not giving him confidence in the real world, is it? He's still as shy as ever. He can't engage with anyone, and he's late for everything. He's leaving meetings to go and go in the holodeck and feel better about himself. It's very self-destructive.
Yeah, he can't accept what's going on in the real world, so he keeps escaping to this fantasy. And yeah, that is having an impact on him, isn't it? So he, as the episode goes on, he sort of is kind of ripped out of that world to a degree. Like he has a moment when he's like, he can't get out almost. But because of all of the things that are happening on the ship with this unknown problem, and they need all hands on deck, he's got to step up to the plate, hasn't he?
He does, but he has help from Geordie. Like you said, everyone else just kind of turns their back on him. And to be fair, so does Geordie. Geordie is ordered to help Reg become a better member of the crew. This is a middle management episode. This is about Geordie, who has a member of staff who is underperforming and he is forced to work on his personal development. This is just middle management in space, right? But Geordie's like forced into that situation, but Geordie's a good guy. He's a professional. He's a Starfleet officer. He takes it seriously, and he does actually commit to that, and he helps Reg come out of his shell. One thing that I thought made Reg very redeemed and likable is that he responds well to that. He is a good guy, and when Geordie like takes him under his wing, he opens up to Geordie, and he's actually able to have a very like mature conversation about his social anxiety and explain to Geordie why he spends so much time in the holodeck. I thought that was a really good moment for Reg that keeps you on side so he doesn't turn into Daly from Callister.
Yeah, because that could have so easily happened. And I mean, it did take me a while to sort of, like I said, Reg was a problematic character for me. I think also there's sort of something about the fact that he's got real people that he knows in his holodeck scenario. And I think that's a very interesting part of the episode.
Yeah, that happens occasionally in Star Trek, but this episode is the episode that like really focuses on it. And it's interesting the way the other characters react to that. Like Riker says, this is against regulations. You can't do this. Like, delete this program. But Geordie's the one who has to be like, well, I don't think there's actually a regulation against it. But it's clearly like taboo. And I thought that was really interesting, right? That it just seemed like this isn't the done thing. You don't put us in your holodeck program.
For someone like Reg, he's given this technology where he can program in his fantasies. And I mean, everyone sort of daydreams and thinks about things, and sort of like you dream about different scenarios with like, you might like people that you know might be in those scenarios and things like that. And yeah, for Reg, he's just taken it one step further. But then it's kind of like, it's still his. So I think the sort of privacy element comes into that, because like any sort of dreams or like daydreams, fantasies, whatever you have, they're not open to the whole world. It's an internal reality thing. But the difference is Reg is putting his internal reality into a program so anyone else can step in.
Yeah, it's basically like, what if you could punch your boss? What if there was a holographic simulation where you could literally punch your boss? That's the thing. But again, it's a little bit like the... do I dare live out the American dream, kill my boss? It's another thing that's a bit like the computer having all of this power to like bring Moriarty to life. It's like the technology just has no regulation over it, and it's just so complicated and so like fantastical and powerful that it can bring Moriarty to life, and there's no limit on that just because Geordie misspoke. And shouldn't there be a rule against simulating real people from the ship? Like, that must be incredibly easy to program in the world of Star Trek, but it just hasn't been done. So it's left up to the characters to kind of mull over the ethics and morality of actually doing that in practice. And apparently no one but Reg has done it, because Reg doesn't fit in with the Starfleet utopia.
And I think the fact you said regulation as well, there's no regulation on the technology, and that's what so much of Black Mirror is about, just not having technology which has been regulated. But obviously this is Starfleet, it's Star Trek. All of this technology should have some sort of regulation on it. But then at the same time, these are characters which have to sort of experience things from themselves. And particularly someone like Reg, the only way we're going to find out about him and for him to get out of his shell is to have this scenario where his fantasies have been made real on the holodeck. And then, like you said, if you could go into a hologram and you could punch your boss, what happens if your boss comes in and sees you punching your boss? And it's kind of like, that's what this episode kind of deals with in a loose way.
So when that happens and Riker walks in and he's furious with him, there's an interesting question there as well about does Reg deserve his privacy when he is in the holodeck? Because there was an interesting moment in the James Bond episode where Bashir is living out his James Bond fantasy. Garak shows up and interrupts the whole thing. And Bashir says, that's illegal. You can't just come in here. I could call Odo and have you arrested. But again, that's not Federation. Odo's not the Federation. That's the law of Deep Space Nine. Does Reg deserve his privacy? He is a serving officer, so there's an element there, you know. But that's his private time. That's his recreation time. I don't know.
I think you're right. It's kind of like on the verge of the two, isn't it? But the thing is that Reg is letting it take control of his life to a point that he can't deal with reality, and it is making him late to meetings, and he is withdrawing from the real world, and it is becoming an obsession, and it's no longer this recreational outlet for him. It's something which he is obsessed with, and he feels like he can only be the him that he wants to be when he is this sort of avatar as well. I think the avatar idea as well is interesting because he's not just himself, he is like a idealized version of himself. He is this like sword fighting, arrogant, can throw his weight around, but is confident with the ladies. He's all of the things that he wants to be, but he just can't be that person in the real world.
Yeah, but again, that's true of like Picard. He goes into a like private detective 1940s pulp sort of novel simulation. That's his thing. And the Western episode, Worf goes in there unwillingly, but because his son wants to go in. But by the end of it, he loves being the rough, tough cowboy sheriff. And I'm sure he'd be quite embarrassed, you know, if someone were to just walk in while he was being a cowboy. So there is an element of it's your private fantasy. To what degree do people have the right to just barge in? Like Riker could have switched off the holodeck before he entered, because they can't find Reg, can they? They're like running around the holodeck, and I was just thinking, like, end the program. It's a small room. Reg will appear at the other end of the room. But no, they continue through the simulation, seeing him sword fighting with a little whiny Riker, and it creates this whole situation between them. But I just thought it was an interesting question. Like, I don't necessarily know if there's a right answer to it, because, yeah, he's on the clock. He's a naval officer. His superior officer has a right to walk in there and know where he is. But it's a very private fantasy when you're in the holodeck.
I think even the name of this episode, Hollow Pursuits, it's kind of like it's very leading, isn't it? Because are Reg's pursuits in the holodeck hollow, or are they helping him in some sort of way, like to cope with the real world? So it's all of these. It throws up a lot of questions, this episode, but I think from it, it becomes a more interesting character.
Well, definitely, and I think they couldn't really have considered this when they titled the episode Hollow Pursuits, which is just a good pun and a good name for the episode. But the proof is in the pudding that Reg does grow as a character, and he becomes like a really interesting recurring secondary character. He's kind of a holodeck expert as well later in the series. He's a good engineer. They call him in when there's problems with the holodeck. That's why you saw him in Ship in a Bottle, because he's the holodeck guy. They'll get him to fix the problems, and he's instrumental in bringing Voyager home, because they communicate with holograms through like a relay. So he's the first person from the Alpha Quadrant to speak to the Voyager crew through like a recorded hologram or something like that. Subspace, something to do with subspace, I don't know. But he's vital to them being able to start communicating again with home, and eventually getting home. So he becomes like a really important character, and like slowly comes out of his shell and finds his place, I guess, in the Starfleet utopia. And that's through his use of it's through his Hollow Pursuits, I guess.
I didn't realize he played such a pivotal role in especially Voyager. That's really like interesting to know. But yeah, and all from this episode where he's larking about in a sort of VR garden.
Yeah, which was probably, I mean, he's Howling Mad Murdoch from the A-Team, isn't he? So I wouldn't have thought they would have necessarily been considering him for like a recurring secondary character. He would be a good guest star for a one-off episode, especially because, you know, he's getting in bar fights at the start like you would expect to see him do in the A-Team, and then he gets to play this terribly socially awkward nerd. So it's a great it's a great, you know, opportunity for him and as an actor to kind of do something a bit unexpected. But yeah, they managed to like spin it out into one of the more interesting background characters.
Yeah, I'm glad you made me watch this one because it was just something which I never would have expected. And for me to have found that in the numerous amounts of Star Trek Next Generation that is on Netflix at the moment, it would have taken a long time. So yeah, thanks for that, Matt.
You're very welcome. Shall we move on to the final episode we're going to look at in detail today then, which is Future Imperfect?
Sounds good to me.
I can explain if you would just give me a moment.
No, you can't. Don't even try. Captain, perhaps it would be best if we discuss this.
Shut up!
Beg your pardon.
I said shut up! As in close your mouth and stop talking.
Will, I sense how upset you are. You're angry and impatient.
Deanna, back off. Well, would anyone else like to speak up? Or shall we end this charade?
So this is a non-recreational experience of VR in Star Trek. It's an episode where VR is used to deceive and imprison somebody. And obviously we've seen a lot of deception and imprisonment this series in VR. But here we see it used to create a ruse. And the ruse is actually a time travel episode, which is another topic we've covered on the podcast.
And again, we're seeing virtual reality and time travel having a link because a lot of the virtual worlds that we've seen throughout the series have been set in different time periods. And initially you do think, okay, maybe it's time travel. And that's what they're doing here. Yes,
and it's interesting you said that because one of those examples is Dark City. And I was quite reminded of Dark City watching this episode because that's one of the major films where VR was used to imprison people, to create a prison for the characters by constructing a virtual reality to trick them. And it was set in like another time period. It was very ill-defined and vague in Dark City, but it's much more clearly defined in Future Imperfect. But the kind of original premise is that it's the Romulans creating this reality around Riker to extract information from him. Whereas, I guess, Dark City was just... There was no information. Well, they were trying to learn about humans, weren't they? But they were just messing with them, kind of.
Yeah, this one goes on a few twists and turns as well again, doesn't it? So, like, when I first started watching it, because I knew it was going to have something to do with virtual reality, I was kind of looking for things which were a little bit off. And obviously the first thing that strikes you is the fact that the computers are slow to load. So you're wondering what's going on there. Is there something that is stopping them? Like, what did you think when you saw all that?
Very good, James. Very wise. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's definitely, it's a spoiler, isn't it, to watch this episode, particularly if you're watching it for the first time, preparing to do an episode for the VR series of your podcast. But yeah, that's a bit disappointing. I guess because it's Star Trek, you always know that like it's not going to stay in the future. You know, if someone just randomly jumps into the future in a Star Trek episode, you know they're going to be back by the end of the episode. The future is never going to last, and it's always kind of, it's a simulation in the sense that when you go back to the present, the future's then going to change anyway, so the future doesn't exist as it did. But yeah, it's a rug pull, and there's another rug pull, which is that it's a multi-level VR, like Ship in a Bottle. It's not the simulation that you first thought it was. But yeah, you're right to like pick up on those little things as well. I guess then, did you pick up on any little things after Riker comes out on the Romulan ship? What were you thinking was going on then?
Well, I think it was when the boy turned up again. And like, again, the thing is with Star Trek, they can have explanations for things and you instantly believe them because it's Star Trek. So even with Riker's disease condition thing from like the alien bacteria that means that he forgot things for like however many years he was suddenly in the future, that seems believable because it's something that could happen in the Star Trek universe. But it was something about seeing the kid again in the Romulan like camp or whatever it was, and I was like, okay, so it's this specific kid, but there's something a little bit off about him. And it's when it started ramping up and they were like escaping the Romulans and trying to do the escape plan, and they figured it all out, that's when I was a bit like, okay, something might be a bit up here.
Yeah, and I was actually reminded of Total Recall a little bit there when they go on the run in the Romulan facility. The way the characters are kind of like propelled with action, so they don't have time to like think. Riker doesn't have time to analyze really, or they're trying to prevent him from having time to analyze and realize that he's in a simulation, similar to the way that in Total Recall Quaid is just sent on this just ridiculous action movie quest all the time, action all the time, step it up a level, every scene something else happens, so he just kind of like gets swept up in the drama of it. They're trying to do the same thing to Riker to keep him locked in the simulation, right?
Yeah, it's definitely got Total Recall vibes now that you mention it. And yeah, because it keeps ramping up. They are sort of trying to keep him invested in this simulation, because the more time he has to think about it, the more chance that he's going to figure it all out. And I mean, that's what he eventually does. But it's such a sort of like, there is so much detail put in all of these little scenarios as well. Like, they've put in a lot of effort into this virtual reality.
Yeah, and that makes sense kind of the first time it's revealed, because they're Romulans, and we know the Romulans are sneaky and they'll do anything to get one over on the Federation. But then what did you think about like the final reveal that it was all... I mean, the reason I asked about psychic projections in X-Men earlier is because that's kind of what's going on at the end, right? There's some devices that they don't really get explained. It's quite a sudden ending, but they're just projecting into the minds of Barash, I think is the name of the alien, and Riker, and I guess anyone else who goes in this weird cave.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting way to throw in the virtual reality, because it's kind of got those elements of internal realities added into it, because it's all based on Riker's past and kind of almost his fantasies as well, because him having a kid and having a wife, they're all part of like things which Riker obviously wants, which make it something which Riker wants to invest in. And that's why this whole first half of the episode is so involved. But one of the things I wanted to talk about as well was, so his wife, you get the sense that she's been in another episode. Do you know much about this? Like what was going on there? Because I did not remember or know.
Yeah, that's like just a massive callback, which I don't know. I think you probably got enough context, but I don't know, maybe it's not terribly well explained. That's just a holodeck character from like a season 1 episode that he sort of fell in love with, because she was more than your average holodeck character. She was programmed by aliens to deceive him, and he ended up falling in love with her. But he had like real emotions for her, is the point in Future Imperfect, to the point where the people who are trying to deceive him, be it Romulans or psychic aliens, just picked up on the emotional connection that he felt and then drew that out. But yeah, she's called Minuet. She was in some like jazz simulation that he was hanging out in, because he loves jazz with his trombone. And yeah, they just pulled the wrong thread, I guess. So Riker has this moment of like, reality just falls apart because he sees something that he knows to be physically impossible. I couldn't have been married to that woman. I know she was a hologram. So we got a problem here. And then everything just unravels after that. And it's like, and to compare it again to another like VR thing that we looked at, it's Truman coming to the realization that the world around him is all make-believe. There's one thing that has just now got in his head that he just can't accept, and then everything else just unravels to the point where he's like yelling at Admiral Picard on the bridge and all that. That was great.
So I mean, even that's really layered. So the alien who is projecting this world in this episode picks out a hologram which was created by another group of aliens, which was used to deceive Riker previously. So it's kind of inceptioned it, hasn't it?
Yeah. He's constantly getting screwed over by this woman that he fell in love with in a simulation. Yeah. Well, it's they're drawing out like his own memories and stuff, aren't they, to build the simulation? That's how the VR works in Future Imperfect. It's on both levels as well, because it's kind of the same explanation. The Romulans that turn out to be fake, they say that they've probed his mind, and they just pulled out what they could, and then constructed a VR simulation based off of that. So it's working in the same way on both levels, but there's no real holodeck. It's kind of a different technology that isn't really explained because they don't have to. But yeah, there's lots of different like types of VR and themes that we've seen from loads of different episodes, isn't there?
Yeah, there's like such a wealth of stuff in here. And I mean, I'm sure we could go on and on about all of the different holodeck episodes. I mean, there must be like so many in there, and so many instances where the holodeck is used even sort of like in little moments and things like that, because it is such a part of the ship.
Yeah, they get into lots of different things. I mean, the reason that I picked Next Generation stuff is that the holodeck was properly introduced in season 1 of Next Generation. They didn't have it in the original series, and it became just this huge thing for the writers to just tell like interesting, fun or silly stories that I think all of the most interesting holodeck episodes were done by the end of Next Generation. There's some really fun ones, and there's some really moving ones as well later when Nog loses his leg in Deep Space Nine. He becomes a little bit hikikomori as well. He disappears off into a holodeck simulation, and he just wants to stay there and hang out there. There's interesting stories to be told, but I think they got so much out of the way in Next Generation that, it was the area to focus on. And to be honest with you, James, I really wanted to talk about Future Imperfect because the comm badges that they have in the future, for some reason, have stuck in my mind as one of my favourite like individual things in Star Trek ever. I don't know why, but when I was a kid, I was just obsessed with the fact they're different. They got different badges in the future. That's so cool. And you only see it once in one episode. I mean, I had forgotten that future world was a simulation and it wasn't even real. In my memory, it was just like a flash forward episode, and that was going to be the like, that's what the badges look like in the future. And I don't know, I was just obsessed with it. I really wanted to talk about this one.
Yeah, because I thought like, not knowing that much about Star Trek, I thought the lines were to do with rank or something, because there's like little lines underneath.
They are, yeah. I never picked up on that until I watched it back for this, but because the other thing I noticed watching it back was no one's got pips on their collars to denote rank. And then in the next scene, I saw another character only had 3 lines underneath their badge, whereas Riker's got 4. So yeah, in that future, they've got instead of pips on their collars, they have their rank denoted on their badge. You're absolutely right. What an amazing detail, though. Like the costuming on Star Trek, it's better on Deep Space Nine, but across the franchise, so good. That's where your $1 million an episode is going, to have that level of detail to make it look futuristic and different from the present day. Really good stuff.
Although there was one episode which I really noticed because we were watching all of these back to back. Jean-Luc Picard has a weird little jacket on as opposed to his usual thing. And like I was looking this up afterwards, and it was a thing that just randomly had in the series. And I was really taken aback by that. Like, he's not wearing his usual uniform. What's going on?
He wears that quite often. I think it's just it's a slightly less formal jacket that he can wear. It's still the correct command colour. I think he wears it when he's not like on duty on the bridge, but he expects he might be called to the bridge at any given moment. He's not on like shore leave on another planet, so he's kind of on call. He's the captain, but that kind of shows you that, like, well, you know, if it's not an emergency, can you talk to Riker? He's on the bridge. I'm going to go and play my pipe in my office.
And if he's not doing that, he's probably on the holodeck, isn't he? Because that's where everyone seems to be all the time on Star Trek.
Yeah, exactly. And they do cool stuff in Voyager as well, where, I say cool stuff, they just like have interesting concepts because they're stranded, they've got less fuel, and they can't contact their families. So they're desperate to get in the holodeck, but they have to like ration that out. and they can't use it for as long as they might want to, and they all have to take turns to make sure. And then Tom Paris has like his black and white Captain Proton. We saw a bit of that when we did AI, didn't we? So we they do interesting things across different series, but for me, it's all about that comm badge in the future.
Well, I think that might be it for our Star Trek episode this time round. It has been a pleasure, Matt, going through these episodes with you. It's the one time where I get to dip into Star Trek and just be guided by the wealth of knowledge you have.
Oh, I'm always delighted to make you watch Star Trek, James. And thank you so much to the listeners who gave us some great suggestions for this one as well. And just keep them coming, and come and join our Facebook discussion group and talk about your favourite episodes there. Because I know that there's so many great holodeck episodes, and we just did not have the time to watch them and discuss them for this episode. But please come and join the conversation on Facebook, and we'll keep that one going for the holodeck episodes.
Yes, please do. There's just too much Star Trek to cover, unfortunately. But if you are looking for more content, we are on Patreon. You can come and find us on there. And for a small fee per month, you can get bonus content, bonus episodes. We cover different films, series, lots of stuff on there. And one of the main things over there, we want to hear from you guys. What do you want to hear us covering on the Patreon feed?
And thank you so much, and welcome to our new patron, Noel, who's joined the Cool Club. If you can't afford to join Patreon, or you just don't want to do that, that's absolutely fine. You can leave us a nice review on iTunes or your podcasting app of choice. That's really helpful. Why don't you leave us a review? Why don't you let us know what your favourite holodeck episode is there as well?
Yes, please do. That would be great. In the meantime, if you want to get in contact with us, we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We've got a website. Just look up @ThroughSci-Fi or @ThroughSci-Fi Pod. We'll be around.
Join us next time for our conclusion episode, where we'll be wrapping up our VR series.
I can't believe it's that time already, Matt. That's just scary. We've raced through an entire series already.
Yeah, we will do our customary awards show, so join us next time for that.